called Let's Talk, Pivot Points, and Snapping. These two things kind of work together. So I won't be exhaustive about this, but what we're seeing now is this kind of central corridor of things. We just were looking at global and local transforms. We're now going to start looking at pivots. So a pivot point is directly related to the origin conversation that we had earlier. Let's go ahead and keep it on what it is right now, which is the median point. And I'm going to have these two objects here. I'm going to go into isolation mode with more than the single object. So if I shift click on two different objects and then / these two objects go together. Right now, their origins, this origin is here, this origin is here. If I shift click, we can see both of them. The median point of these two origins is some fictitious point between these two things. Now, how do I find that? Why is that relevant? If I was to scale these two objects now while they're selected, so I'm going to hit S with my cursor all the way over here, now I see that median point as where that little dash line is going to. And it's scaling based on the median point between these two objects. That is the typical behavior. The next thing that we can do is we can have the scale based on the active element. So I'm going to choose this one. Now, this is a little confusing, so let's go ahead and parse it out. Both of these objects are selected, but the last object selected is amber. The first object selected and any other object selected before is going to show up as orange. This lets you know which object is the active object. The active object is amber. It's the last thing that's selected. So that means if I scale this, it's going to have its whole relationship of the scale is going to be based on this object or this object's origin. So let's test. Sure enough, there it is. Now, what if I wanted them to scale individually? Well, sure enough, scale. Now each object is going to scale on its own origin point. Very different behavior than scaling as a median point. See how the objects scale together versus scale individually. Now the next one, which is actually important, and I use this much more than I thought I would, scaling based on where the 3D cursor is. So let's say that I want that 3D cursor to, well, let's just scale it right now based on the 3D cursor, and then I'll move it. So I've just hit 3D cursor and I scale, and now it's all scaling based on where the 3D cursor is located. But let's say I want the 3D cursor to actually be like right here. Have a think. How do I move the 3D cursor to a very specific selected point? If you thought, go into the object, edit it, select the point in space, and hit Shift S, move cursor to selected, then tab out, you thought correctly. But I'm also going to say that that is a pretty intense workflow with like 5 or 6 steps. And so after a while, you'll start feeling more comfortable about moving the 3D cursor around, but it is something I want to make you aware of. It's an important practice. Now, having the 3D cursor be the thing that you pivot your scale on or rotation on is kind of cool. So we're just scaling this. If I have both objects selected, they'll scale based on that. But the other thing is rotation. Let's say that I've actually got like a light here. I'm going to just delete this guy for now. And I want this light to kind of rotate on this 3D cursor as though it was like a gimbal. Well, remember, if I hit rotate once, it'll rotate on that. But if I hit RR, now it acts kind of like a roller ball. So that is like a point that this light will rotate on. So this is kind of cool and kind of important to be able to do just that. So that's why we have that. The next is a bounding box rotation. So I'm actually going to tab out and let's undo. I want both there. I'm going to select everything. So hit A and then deselect the things I don't want to move. So I'm going to press and hold Command or Control and I guess it's Shift. Click on that. Click on the camera. I don't want the camera to move, and I don't want the plane to move. So I've press and hold Shift, and you'll notice that when I shift click on something in an active group, the first click turns that object active. The second click deselects it. But if I click again, I can add it right back. And at this point, it doesn't matter which one's active because we're going to say we're going to organize this based on a bounding box center. So now I've got a whole bunch of stuff here that's selected, and if you were to imagine all of these has a center point that would be in this volumetric box, that's what I'm going to be editing on now. So I'm going to scale it, and you can see that there's this like odd kind of point in space. Now that's slightly different than the median point of all these objects. The median point is just a little lower. Let's see if I can see that here. Versus the bounding box, it's just a little higher. And so the bounding box would be the volumetric space of all these objects take up, whereas the median point is literally the calculation of where the origins all are. So it's slightly different. It's a hair different. I actually don't know if I've ever used the difference between these two things, but that is how to change the transform pivot points. What I would like you to do is to play with this. Grab two objects by shift-clicking on them, isolate them, and then just make sure that you can scale or rotate based on the median point, active element, individual point, and 3D cursor. You don't have to do the bounding box for now.